Well, it's that time of year again. I'm out here at Southpark. The year is 2012. My name is Blair. I'm the owner of Saratoga Tree Service. I've been doing the work here at Southpark for a long time. I believe the first year we worked out here was about 1992, so we've been about 20 years here. And I'd like to take a few minutes here and explain some of the trees and some of the problems so that you can better understand my decision-making process. So let's go for a walk. As we come into the complex on South Drive, one of the first things that you'll notice is a number of large Zelkova trees and increasingly fewer of the tulip trees. Now, typically we like to do the Zelkova trees just about every year for a couple of reasons. Number one, a lot of these branches are hanging down really low and the garbage trucks hit them, and as they get heavier they'll sag onto the buildings. But also, this is a type of tree that is subject to squirrel invasion, so there's a lot of branches that get chewed on. I don't know if you can see that one up there. There's lots and lots of dead branches, so it just leaves the whole complex unsightly. So I'm going to put the Zelkovas back down again for pruning. Now you have a few species of trees that are problematic, and they're recognized species that do have failures from time to time, such as the larger eucalyptus. We like to trim those about every 2 years. There will be some that need it and some that don't, so I'm going to itemize those out. Now here's a problem that I've pointed out to you many times over the years, and it's still happening. Some of the younger trees, this happens to be a crepe myrtle, beautiful tree. It's continuously being hit by the weed whacker, scalped by the lawnmowers. The constant impact from the equipment, from the landscaping crews, are causing quite a bit of damage to a number of your tender trees in this complex. So very, very important that let's see, this is all fresh damage right in through here. That needs to be addressed. It needs to stop. This tree looks okay, but it would be fuller and nicer and healthier if it didn't have the bark compromised and damaged. The alder trees are continuing to decline. This one is completely dead and the one behind it is dying. So I've never recommended doing any pruning work on the alder trees because it's, in my opinion, it's a waste of money to try to preserve something that is so short-lived. You can pretty much expect all of the alder trees to time out in this complex. They do have a lifespan to the tree, and they have reached the very end of that lifespan. You have a number of young redwood trees throughout the complex, and many of them are still staked. The stakes are good when they're young, but at this point in time, many of them are actually, they're being a little bit constricted by the ties. And I believe it's time to go through and remove all these stakes. They should not be forgotten. Stakes can cause a lot of damage if they're neglected. Yeah, this one right here is so tight it's actually starting to create a crease around the tree. And these stakes aren't anywhere near as strong as the tree. They're doing nothing. That was actually broken in the ground. So time to go. Get rid of all the stakes on these young redwood trees. Now we did a lot of the pear trees last year, the flowering pears, and a lot of them are still looking pretty good. You know, we got that occasional spot where they're touching the building or touching the fireplaces, getting close to the areas. But really, I think I'm going to pass on most of the flowering pears this year. I think you can go another year. Here's another big eucalyptus that it's getting pretty heavy. One of the problems with these eucalyptus is they get the seed pods, and those seed pods are very, very heavy, and they cause limbs to fail. And you've got a lot of these delicate roofs around here that if a branch is to hit the roof, it'll they're kind of a metal type of a roof. They'll cause the roofs to dent, and actually you can puncture them as well. So I do recommend keeping these eucalyptus trees, especially near the buildings. A little thinner, a little lighter, and hopefully a little safer. Fraxinus UDI, evergreen ash. This is one of the giants of the tree world. And you've got a few of them. One of the big problems with this tree is that many of them will develop an excessive number of seed pods. And those seed pods can actually weigh the tree down, and that will cause the branches to die. It also leaves the tree looking unsightly. It looks like there's a lot of dead up there, but it's actually the brown of the seed pods. So we have had a number of large failures from this species of tree in your complex over the years. So I believe that the large evergreen ash trees are also a species that we need to address. The white bark European birch. It's a beautiful species. However, it is susceptible to the bronze birch borer, and as you can see by looking up at the top of this tree right here, it's dying from the top down. And while this tree has a lot of foliage on it, it is going downhill quickly. So a lot of this greenery that you see is actually the epicormic suckering that comes out of the trunk, but the main body of the trunk, or the top of the tree, is declining and working its way down. Now I like this tree. It is a tree that does have some problems, but it's such an unusual variation in color that I'm not discouraging you from planting more, but do understand that they are a type of tree that can have some problems. They're fairly low maintenance. You don't spend a lot of money on these birch trees, so not a bad choice where you have a tight area and just need some added attraction from say the white bark of the trunk. Liquid ambers. This one's a little bit yellow, and the ones further down are quite a bit darker green. These are going to be beautiful in the fall here. They're going to start turning colors. This one that's a little bit yellow, there's a disease that's attacking the liquid ambers, and it's a trunk canker disease that causes the foliage of these trees to turn lighter, and you can see the veins will show up a little bit better. Let me go a little closer and I'll show that to you. All right, here's a leaf from a tree that's infected. Note the yellowing tinges and that the veins are really sticking out. Some of the leaves are not looking quite as bad, but when you look throughout the whole tree, you can really see clearly, you know, the loss of chlorophyll, and just some of the veins in the leaves are still sticking out, but the rest of the leaves are not looking so good. Now if you compare those to a healthier liquid amber, let's walk down to another tree. Now this tree does not show any signs of the trunk canker at all. I can see all the leaves are nice and full, and there's a greenness throughout. You know, I spoke too soon, there's a little bit in through here. But it's usually when you see that throughout the tree that it's the first signs of the trunk canker. And when you look at the trunk, it's really, really hard to see that anything is going on. Occasionally you'll see some weeping, especially some of the cracks. You'll see a little bit of oozing that's coming out. And what's happening is there's a trunk canker disease that's actually kind of closing off all the transport tubes in the system of the tree. Unfortunately, there isn't anything that you can do about it except keep the trees as healthy as you possibly can. But sometimes we see liquid ambers die of this problem. One of the biggest things that you have to concern yourself with is that the location of many of your trees are right next to the buildings, and they'll get up and over the chimneys. So you don't necessarily have to trim these trees, but you're almost forced to do so because of where they're growing. Hackberry, Celtis occidentalis. You've got quite a few hackberries in the complex, and they're beautiful shade trees. They do get too large. We can see that we've got them growing all the way down. And one of the big problems with the trees, well, it's not the trees, it's those guys. You've got so many squirrels. For some reason, the squirrels love to chew on the bark of these hackberry trees. And if you look up here, you can see up there's a dead tip. You got a lot of dead branches. We trimmed all that stuff out not very long ago. It was just last year. We went through and we cut out all the dead branches that we could. And everywhere you look, the hackberries have got more and more dead in them. The zelkovas, they're also afflicted by this squirrel chewing problem. So just for aesthetics, we almost have to trim many of your hackberry trees in the complex. Some of them don't look too bad. This one over here doesn't look too bad, a little bit of dead wood up in it. But in time, the branches do sag down, they do go rather wide, they will fill in very quickly, and if we don't keep up on them, it's just a matter of a couple of years before they're just incredibly overgrown looking. So hackberries, we got to keep up on the hackberries. Now over in the pool area, there are a number of trees, including the Chinese elms. And I want to point out a couple of the trees, the ones closest to the back fence. There's a lot of dead up here, and there's a lot of dead over here, and we cleaned all this out last year. Unfortunately, these trees have a disease called anthracnose. Not all Chinese elms are afflicted with this, and as you can see, the one right behind here looks much better, as well as this one over here. But for some reason, the two on the outside have got an awful lot of the anthracnose. All we can do with this is to continually cut out some of the diseased branches. It generally doesn't kill the tree, but it does leave it rather unsightly. And it wasn't that many years ago that these trees were much fuller and much nicer, so this is a fairly new problem with these trees. There's yet another one of the Fraxinus udii, the giant evergreen ash. And I'm showing you this one to point out right up here. You can see where a big limb split out up on here. So they are fairly fragile trees, and because they're so heavy and so close to the buildings, I feel like we're almost obligated to recommend pruning these trees. They're beautiful trees, they're beautiful shade trees, but they're so massive that a failure from one of these trees can be dramatic. Now I know you've put a lot of effort into trying to spray for the scale on your tulip trees, and actually some of these trees are looking a little bit better, but there's still a lot of scale up there. I can tell there's scale because you look at the branches and there's sort of a black mold on many of the branches. Some of the new leaves look like they're coming out, but it's almost an endless battle. And I hate to be negative about these trees, but it's almost a hopeless battle in our area. Once again, we rarely recommend pruning of the tulip trees unless there's one that's really unsightly. And then there's the Monterey pine. Sometimes they'll linger for years, but once you start seeing all this dieback on the ends, that's usually an indicator that the tree is infected with the Ips pine beetle. It's a little beetle that generally flies in from the top. It bores into the trunk of the tree, lays its eggs, and it's the larva that does the damage. Pruning the trees usually does not help much at all, and frankly, this is a species that you've almost eradicated them. You've still got, you know, some, especially out by the railroad tracks, but a lot of the interior Monterey pines have already been removed. So one by one you're getting rid of these problems, but do you want to spend money pruning them and keeping them looking good, only to spend more money removing them when they decline? That's a question. Some cases, if a tree looks really bad, you almost have to, but most of them, I think it's best just to let them be. Now, occasionally you'll come across a tree within your complex and you look on the ground. This is the Zelkova serrata, and you'll find all these little leaf tips that have been nipped off by the squirrels. And for some reason, they seem to choose a few specific trees and target those, but the ground can be really unsightly with all these little cut pieces. You can see by the amount of debris in the gutter out there that this is a target tree. I can see a squirrel's nest way up there. Maybe it's the young. I'm not quite sure why this tree is so much worse than the others, but squirrels, that's another problem. Got to deal with the squirrels. And back to the squirrels. We've got their favorite nesting material, the bark of redwood trees. They like to pull the bark off and they make really nice warm nests out of it. So you've got a lot of the squirrel's favorite trees in your complex for both food and for nesting material. So add that to the fact that you've got a lot of people that feed these critters. You've got an enormous squirrel problem. I know I keep repeating myself, but maybe there's some new people on the board that have not heard that story. I'm sure they're aware of it. But we rarely do any pruning work to the redwood trees, with the exception of a little bit of building clearance and maybe an occasional big dead branch. I see one dead branch way up high there that's a little unsightly. It's not unsafe, but sometimes for aesthetic reasons we like to get the dead wood out. You know, most of the liquid ambers are still looking pretty good. I think for the most part we can give them all another year. So I think I'm going to pass on the liquid ambers this year. Way in the back there we've got a Modesto ash that's been giving us fits for years. Last year it just looked horrible. It really looked bad. It was really infected with the anthracnose, and you can see that there are a lot of limbs way up inside there that have completely died back. Let's go look at that a little closer. Now both of these trees, you look at this side, nice and full. That side, all the way up, it looks terrible. And there's a lot of individual branches on this tree that are also looking pretty bad. So what do? You know, if we take out those branches that are half dead and half alive, it's going to leave some big holes in this tree. I can see there's a lot of new life popping out of some of the branches that look like they're totally dead. So, well, I hate to say it, I think you almost need to sit on this one for a while and see what's going to happen. Because if you jump the gun and take out some of these branches that are already starting to sprout back, you'll leave the tree unrepairable in those areas because there won't be any branches left. Obviously some of the branches are entirely dead, and we can do a little bit of cleanup on some of those. That will make it look a little better. But this is a problem that, once again, there isn't any solution to it. And why this one branch is infected and the rest of the tree is not, it's one of the mysteries that I cannot answer. Sorry. Now here we have a fresh tear on a liquid amber. You see down low right here. And this is a problem because of what happened in an area of the tree. This is called a crotch inclusion. Let me get a little closer to that and I'll explain it better. Generally, a liquid amber is a single leader tree. You'll have a single main trunk that goes up and everything branches off of it. And that's the ideal form. But every once in a while, you'll find a tree that has a Y in it, and it'll double off and it'll have two tops. And what you end up with is, as each of these grows, they actually push on each other, and they create quite a bit of pressure down at this weakness. You can see how dark it is up in there. And ultimately, all it takes is a little bit of wind, or sometimes no wind at all, and the weaker half will split off. This is a weaker tree. It's already been pruned out. There's been a few branches taken off by the building, but it's an inherent weakness in a few individual trees, but as a species, it's usually not a big problem. Flowering plum. You've got a lot of beautiful flowering plums in the property. They are a tree that does seem to have a lifespan to them. And I know you've lost a lot of your flowering plums over the years. They've died of old age. We don't usually do a whole lot of work to them. They are more of an aesthetic issue than a maintenance issue. They look nice when you take out all those inside suckers up and through there and open them up and maybe separate them and clear the buildings. But we've almost always worked on priorities of urgency based upon hazardous trees, trees that are growing into buildings, trees that are affecting traffic. And a lot of these trees get neglected every year because you've got a lot of trees to deal with. So if you have the money, it would be nice to do some work on the flowering plums, but that's purely aesthetic. It's not as much of a safety issue. When you look at the base of this flowering plum, you can see this big basidiocarp growing down here. That's a wood mushroom, and this doesn't kill the tree. This is growing off of a decay area in the tree. These only show up if there's part of the tree that is rotting. So that's one of the first symptoms that you'll see that the tree is declining. You'll see a lot of areas where the old wounds are drying out and it's starting to rot. There's some cracking in the bark here. And this tree really is, there's not a lot left to it. It's just basically, a few water sprouts, but it's still here, so I don't say get rid of it, but this is kind of the fate of a lot of these plum trees. Oh, those are sure pretty. You don't see those too often. And here's another plum. You can see the growths on the ground. They almost look like bark. And at this time of year, they're not a different color. They've dried out. But you can see a big growth right here and a big fungal growth down here. These big brackets, they're telling me that the base of this tree has got quite a bit of decay in it. This is another flowering plum, and if you look up into it, it doesn't look bad, but it's going downhill. So once again, do you want to spend money on trees that are going downhill, or do you want to just wait till they die? You have 2 jacarandas on the property. I've mentioned them before. They're beautiful trees. They flower purple flowers that are just outstanding. They're a frost-sensitive tree. Not a tree that I would recommend as a replacement tree unless you're looking for a little bit of a focal point and you're willing to accept the possibility of them freezing. In a bad frost, the jacarandas will die. And another issue is clearance for the lights. So we always try to cut back the branches around the street lights that you have, especially out on South Drive. A bit more squirrel damage up there. And there's your row of Monterey pines. They're hanging in there. We've had to cut them back from the road a few times because they were hanging down too low for the trucks. But they're hanging in there. They're not looking great though, so not quite sure what to say about those trees. Let them be. As the Monterey pines were dying off, Dave Tiedemann started bringing in these redwood trees. I remember when all of these were planted. None of these trees are 20 years old, and they've never required any pruning whatsoever. So as a replacement tree, I think you're doing well by reintroducing the redwood trees. Now sometimes people ask me, they say, well, can't we start planting redwood trees in between these trees? And the answer is no. Without full sun, they would just limp along and be leggy little trees that you'd have to avoid when the tree ultimately above it dies and you have to remove it. But they don't thrive unless they're given full sun. So sometimes you think it's a good move to anticipate, but in this case, as the trees die, then you can put a couple of redwoods back in, and ultimately all of this will end up looking more like this. Well, thanks for taking the time to view this brief presentation on your complex. I hope it's been educational. And maintenance of a place like this is an ongoing process, and as your trees get older and older, they get bigger and bigger, and you end up with a lot of long-term problems. But on the positive side, I've got to say that your complex is one of the most beautiful complexes that we deal with every year, and it's principally because of the trees. So kudos to you for taking such good care of your trees all these years.